It was a crisp morning in the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business, and no secret could stay buried for long. But today, there was a mystery that no one could untangle. The local vicar's daughter, Elizabeth Howard, had been due to marry Simon Creswell, the heir to the neighbouring manor, that very afternoon. The village was already abuzz with preparations for the wedding, the air thick with excitement and anticipation. But when the wedding band, a family heirloom of considerable value and sentiment, went missing from the church vestry hours before the ceremony, everything came to a screeching halt. Miss Marple, who had been sitting in the back pew of the church, knitting her lace as she often did when she had the time to observe the world in its quiet moments, was the first to notice something was amiss. The ring, which had been carefully placed in a velvet box for safekeeping, was gone. The only person who had been in the vestry that morning was the vicar himself, Reverend Martin. But when he was questioned, he was as confused as anyone. The ring had vanished without a trace, and the room had been locked from the inside. There was no sign of a break-in, no windows forced open, nothing to suggest that anyone could have come in or gone out. The mystery was maddening. The vicar, his face pale and stricken with disbelief, was quick to call the police, but it was Miss Marple who took charge of the situation, quietly observing as the officers scrambled about. She made her way into the vestry, her steps light as she surveyed the room with a practiced eye. There were no signs of a struggle, no footprints, no discarded objects. The only clue was a faint, peculiar scent, something floral, yet somehow stale, that lingered in the air. It was odd, but not entirely out of place. The flowers for the wedding had been delivered that morning, and the room had been filled with their perfume. The officers, in their typical hurry to solve the case, began questioning everyone involved in the wedding, staff, family and guests. Elizabeth was in tears, convinced that someone had stolen the ring to ruin her special day. Her fiancé, Simon, stood by her, looking more bewildered than anything else. He seemed to offer little insight, his expression a mixture of frustration and helplessness. It was clear that the theft wasn't just about the ring itself, but the reputation of both families. For the Creswells, the wedding had been a grand affair, one that had been planned for months. The ring had been in the family for generations, and its loss would be seen as a disgrace. For the Howards, it was not only a symbol of their daughter's future happiness, but also a sacred heirloom tied to their faith. The stakes were high, and the pressure was mounting. Everyone was looking to Miss Marple to provide some clarity. Miss Marple, however, remained calm. Her small, unassuming presence was a stark contrast to the chaos around her. As she sat in the vestry and listened to the frantic chatter, she knew that this was no ordinary theft. There was something more at play, something subtle yet deliberate, hidden beneath the surface of the case. She began to methodically examine the room again, this time focusing on the little details. The lock on the door had not been tampered with. The windows, though open, were high and out of reach. The velvet box had no signs of forced entry. But then her eyes settled on a small, inconspicuous object, a scrap of paper wedged between the wooden floorboards. She knelt down, lifting the paper carefully. It was old, yellowed with age and faintly crumpled as though it had been hidden there for some time. As she unfolded it, the faint scent she had noticed earlier became clearer. It was the smell of dried lavender, the same scent as the bouquet of flowers in the church. The paper was inscribed with a short message, written in a hurried, almost panicked hand. If the ring is found, it will be lost again. Take care." It was a strange, cryptic note, one that seemed to mock the very idea of solving the case. But Miss Marple, with her years of experience and sharp intuition, knew that it wasn't a mere coincidence. Someone was playing a game where the rules were meant to confuse and mislead. The question was, who? As she pondered this, the sound of footsteps interrupted her thoughts. It was Detective Inspector Cook, a tall man in his 40s, his brow furrowed with concentration as he entered the vestry. He had been assigned to the case by the local constable, though Miss Marple could see he was clearly out of his depth. "Miss Marple, have you found something?" he asked, trying to sound authoritative, though his voice trembled slightly with uncertainty. Miss Marple didn't immediately answer. Instead, she took a moment to study the inspector. He was young, eager, but lacked the patience and understanding that was so often required to unravel the most perplexing of mysteries. Finally she spoke, her voice soft but resolute. "The ring has not been stolen, Inspector. At least not in the way you think." Cook frowned, clearly puzzled. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple smiled gently, though there was a hint of amusement in her eyes. "The ring is exactly where it should be, at the heart of this mystery. But you're looking in the wrong places. You see, the true theft isn't of the ring itself, but of something far more valuable." The inspector's confusion deepened, but Miss Marple didn't elaborate just yet. She needed time to piece everything together. Her mind worked methodically as she recalled the details: the locked door, the flowers, the cryptic note, the scent of lavender. It was all beginning to make sense, but the answer was not one she could reveal just yet. There was one more thing she needed to understand. One last piece of the puzzle, and she would find it in the unlikeliest of places. Miss Marple had been quiet for a few moments, her mind carefully sifting through the puzzle before her. Detective Inspector Cook, still standing in the vestry, appeared to be waiting for her, to reveal her thoughts, but she wasn't ready yet. She needed one more observation, something small, something that had escaped everyone else's notice. She turned her attention back to the scene, her eyes narrowing as she looked over the room. Again, Cook, clearly growing impatient, shuffled his feet and let out a sigh, but Miss Marple didn't let the distraction break her focus. She stood up and approached the small window at the far end of the vestry. The soft light of the morning streamed through it, casting delicate shadows across the stone floor. Nothing unusual there. But then, as her gaze wandered down toward the flower arrangements near the altar, something caught her attention, a slight disturbance in the way the arrangements had been set up. One vase, slightly off-center, was missing, a single flower. It was a small detail, almost too insignificant to notice, but it stood out to Miss Marple like a flashing light. The flowers were fresh, delivered just that morning, and they had been arranged meticulously, but now there was one less bloom in one of the vases. "Inspector," Miss Marple said, turning toward Cook, her voice as soft as ever. "Do you see the vase there by the altar?" Cook, still not quite grasping her methodical approach, looked at the vase in question and gave a distracted nod. "Yes, what of it?" "There should be one more flower in it," she said, stepping closer. "Look."
"At the arrangement, it's been tampered with."
Cook moved toward her reluctantly, as if this minor detail could hardly be worth his time. But then his expression shifted slightly when he saw it, a single missing stem. He peered at the vase, then looked around, his eyes scanning the floor. "What's this got to do with the ring?" he asked, frustration beginning to creep into his voice. Miss Marple, however, did not answer immediately. She leaned in, her keen eyes catching something hidden beneath the table that supported the flowers. There, partly concealed by a length of fabric, was a small, smooth object. She bent down and carefully retrieved it. It was a silver pin, intricately designed with delicate spirals, something that looked like it could belong to an expensive piece of jewelry. She held it up to the light, her expression thoughtful. The pin, though small, was an unusual object to find in such a setting. She turned it over, examining it closely, before slipping it into her pocket. "Perhaps it's best we keep this between ourselves for now, Inspector," she said calmly, offering him a faint smile. "I think the flower arrangements tell us more than we first realized." Cook opened his mouth, clearly eager to question her. But Miss Marple was already moving on, her mind darting ahead. She stepped away from the altar and motioned for him to follow. "There's more. Have you spoken to Mrs. Jennings, the housekeeper? She seems to know more than she's letting on." Cook frowned, but nodded. "She was the first to arrive this morning, right after the vicar. I've already spoken to her. She doesn't know anything. Her statement's clear." "Perhaps too clear," Miss Marple mused. "I think you should speak with her again." With a heavy sigh, Cook reluctantly agreed, and the two of them made their way toward the back of the church where Mrs. Jennings was standing, wringing her hands. She appeared more anxious than before, her eyes darting around as if she were waiting for something to happen. "Mrs. Jennings," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but firm, "I wonder if you could help us with something. Could you tell me exactly what you saw when you came into the vestry this morning? You said you found the door locked." Mrs. Jennings nodded, her face pale. Yes, I came in to check on things, and it was locked from the inside. I knocked, but no one answered. I tried the door again, and that's when the vicar opened. It for me." "And you didn't notice anything unusual?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Jennings hesitated for a moment, her gaze shifting to the floor. "No, nothing unusual. Just that it was so quiet in there, but I suppose I didn't look as closely as I should have." "And the flowers?" Miss Marple pressed, watching her carefully. Mrs. Jennings glanced toward the altar, her face flushed with the slightest hint of unease. "The flowers were fresh, as they should have been. I didn't touch them." "You didn't notice that one flower was missing?" Miss Marple inquired, her tone mild but persistent. Mrs. Jennings blinked in surprise. "What? Missing? No, I didn't see anything like that. Are you sure?" Miss Marple nodded slowly, taking in the housekeeper's reaction. It was subtle, but Miss Marple was certain she had seen a flicker of guilt in her eyes. A small but crucial detail. "Perhaps you'll forgive me, Mrs. Jennings, but I must ask you to remain available while we finish our inquiries," Miss Marple said kindly. "You may be able to assist us further later on." Mrs. Jennings nodded stiffly, her lips pressed tight. She seemed eager to get away from the conversation, but Miss Marple could see that there was something in her manner that had shifted, a subtle tension, a small crack in her previously composed demeanor. As they left the housekeeper to stand by the side of the church, Miss Marple turned to Cook. The detective inspector had been listening intently, though he had yet to draw any conclusions. "There's more to Mrs. Jennings than meets the eye," Miss Marple said quietly. "You should have another look at her." Cook didn't reply immediately. He was still processing, still uncertain of what exactly to make of Miss Marple's quiet observations. But as they stood there, a new thought began to form in the detective's mind. "Perhaps you're right. he said, his voice slightly softer now. I didn't think to look too closely at her. But what do you make of the pin? Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes glinting with the faintest hint of triumph. It's part of the puzzle. Mrs. Jennings had access to the church this morning, and she may very well know more about that pin than she's letting on. The picture was coming together, slowly but surely, and Miss Marple could feel the tension in the air shift. The theft was no longer about a missing ring, but about something far more intricate, with hidden connections and a web of deception that was just beginning to reveal itself. The game was afoot, and Miss Marple was certain now someone was playing a dangerous game of misdirection, and she was closing in on the truth. The day wore on, and the sense of urgency in the church grew, palpably. Miss Marple stood at the heart of it all, listening, observing, and quietly piecing together the fragments of a puzzle that everyone else was too quick to dismiss. Inspector Cook, though still unsure of her methods, had begun to see that there was more to the case than a simple theft. He had learned over the years that the truth often lay in the subtleties, and Miss Marple's calm demeanour and perceptiveness were steadily guiding him to the heart of the mystery. The next person they spoke to was Reverend Martin, the vicar. He had been present in the vestry when the door had been locked and when the flowers had been delivered. He seemed flustered, his hands trembling slightly as he recounted the events. I assure you, Miss Marple, I never saw anything unusual, he said, his voice tight with strain. I only came in to check on the preparations, and then Mrs. Jennings arrived as usual. She knocked on the door, and I opened it for her. There was nothing strange about it, I promise you. And the ring? Miss Marple asked, her tone gentle, but insistent. You've had the ring in your care for some time, haven't you? The vicar hesitated. Yes, but I don't understand. I never saw the ring after I placed it in its box. I'm not sure how it could have disappeared. I've been too busy with the ceremony to think of such things. Miss Marple studied him carefully. His voice quivered slightly, but it was hard to tell if it was from genuine distress or from the strain of keeping something hidden. He seemed eager to cooperate, but his eyes darted nervously as though he feared a question he was unprepared to answer. You mentioned earlier that you hadn't seen the ring after placing it in its box, she said. Yet when the door was open for Mrs. Jennings, you were already inside the vestry. That's odd, don't you think? Wouldn't you have noticed if anyone had been inside before? Reverend Martin shifted uncomfortably. I can't say I noticed anyone. Perhaps I was distracted. I'm afraid my thoughts were elsewhere. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Distracted, yes. But it seems that you were in the vestry longer than you realized, and yet you didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze now fixed on the floor. I suppose I didn't. Miss Marple allowed the silence to hang for a moment longer before speaking again, her voice calm, but carrying the weight of understanding. I'm sure you're under a great deal of pressure today, Reverend, but it's important that we get the facts straight. Reverend Martin looked up, his face a mixture of fear and guilt, but before he could respond, they were interrupted by the sudden appearance of Simon Creswell, the groom. I've been looking everywhere for you, he said, his voice strained and sharp. His eyes were bloodshot, and his hands trembled as he clutched the edge of the pew. What's going on? Have you found the ring yet? We're still investigating, Miss Marple replied calmly, her gaze assessing him with the same quiet intensity. I'm sure you understand how important it is to remain calm, Mr. Creswell. The details are crucial. Simon's eyes flickered toward Reverend Martin before he looked back at Miss Marple, his face twisted with frustration. I don't care about the details. I just want the ring back. If someone's taken it, I want them found. Now. His eagerness was telling. It wasn't the desperation of someone who had lost something precious, but the impatience of a man who was more concerned with appearances than with the actual loss itself. It was subtle, but Miss Marple could sense the underlying tension in his words. "Mr. Creswell, I understand your distress," Miss Marple said, her tone soothing. "But we need to keep our heads about us. I'm sure the ring will turn up. I suggest we continue with the questioning, and perhaps you can help by answering a few more questions. You were in the vestry earlier today, were you not?" Simon's jaw tightened, and for a moment Miss Marple saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Fear, perhaps. Or was it guilt? It was hard to say. "Yes," he replied quickly, "but I wasn't the only one. There were plenty of people in and out today. The staff, the decorators, the florists. I've been busy with the arrangements, you know, the ceremony, the guests." "You didn't see anything unusual?" Miss Marple pressed. Simon's gaze shifted uncomfortably. "Nothing that I can recall." "Look, Miss Marple, I'm not the one who should be under suspicion here. I have nothing to do with the disappearance of that ring." Miss Marple, with her soft, deliberate smile, watched him carefully. "Of course, Mr. Creswell. We are simply trying to get to the bottom of things. You must understand that these questions are routine." Simon nodded stiffly and excused himself, clearly eager to distance himself from the conversation, but Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on him. There was something about his reaction, too quick, too defensive, that didn't sit quite right. He was hiding something, though whether it was connected to the ring's disappearance or something else she couldn't yet tell. With Simon gone, Miss Marple's next step was to talk to Elizabeth Howard, the bride. She had been a quiet presence in the church, her eyes red-rimmed from crying, but there was a stillness about her now, a certain calm that seemed almost out of place. When she spoke, it was with a measured grace, as though she had rehearsed her words. "I don't understand how this could have happened," Elizabeth said, her voice wavering only slightly. "I had the ring. I held it in my hand this morning. I put it in the box myself. How could it be gone?" Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, watching Elizabeth's reaction carefully. There was a slight quiver in her voice, but her eyes didn't betray any real emotion. No true panic, no deep sorrow. Elizabeth seemed more surprised by the theft than truly devastated by it. "Were you alone in the vestry when you placed the ring in its box?" Miss Marple asked. Elizabeth hesitated, her gaze flickering toward the floor. Yes, I was alone. I didn't see anyone else. I'm sure of it." The slight hesitation before her response, the uncertainty in her eyes. Miss Marple was sharp enough to catch it. Elizabeth's statement was more rehearsed than genuine, and there was something she wasn't saying. "Perhaps you could help us by recounting the events of this morning in detail," Miss Marple said, her voice warm, but probing. As Elizabeth began to speak, the contradictions began to pile up. She couldn't recall who had entered the vestry after her. She didn't remember seeing anyone near the box, and her recollection of events was vague at best. It was almost as if she were trying to convince herself of the story she was telling. Miss Marple's mind was working quickly now. The more she listened, the more the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. Elizabeth's behavior, Simon's defensiveness, Reverend Martin's nervousness, it all pointed to one thing: deception. Each person had their own version of events, and each one was trying to hide something. The question now was not whether they were all lying, but why. As the voices of those involved in the mystery swirled around her, Miss Marple knew one thing for certain: the truth was there, buried beneath the lies, and she would find it, no matter how deeply it was hidden. Miss Marple sat quietly in the back of the church, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The morning had been full of hurried questioning, but as the day wore on, the pattern of deception began to emerge, though it was far from straightforward. The faces of the suspects lingered in her mind, each one a potential key to unlocking the mystery, yet none of their motives made complete sense. Greed, jealousy, fear. There were layers beneath each of them, a tangled web that she would have to unravel carefully. Inspector Cook, still uncertain of Miss Marple's methods, had retreated to a corner to confer with his team, but Miss Marple wasn't so quick to give up on the puzzle. Every word, every action from the people involved had to be carefully weighed. There was no simple answer, no one singular cause behind the theft of the ring, and that was what intrigued her most. As Miss Marple sifted through her observations, her mind returned to Elizabeth Howard. The bride's vague recollections, her strange detachment, had left an unsettling impression. Was it possible that Elizabeth was hiding something more than just a lost ring? Miss Marple thought back to the look on her face when she had spoken of the ring. Was it fear or something else? Elizabeth had made a point to tell Miss Marple that she had been alone when she placed the ring in its box. But was that truly the case? Had someone else entered the vestry without her noticing? Then there was Simon Creswell, the groom. His reaction had been too defensive. His eagerness to retrieve the ring more about maintaining control than grief over a precious object. He had been quick to dismiss any notion that he might have had something to do with the theft, but Miss Marple had noticed how his eyes had flitted toward Elizabeth when he spoke. Did he know something she didn't? Or was he too hiding something? Reverend Martin had his own role to play in this complex mystery. His behavior had been more nervous than guilt-ridden, but the details he had provided didn't quite add up. If he had been in the vestry longer than he admitted, could he have seen something? Perhaps he had been distracted by something else. Fear of a scandal, perhaps, or fear of being involved in something more sinister. His hesitance to answer Miss Marple's questions had been telling. There was something about him that didn't sit right. And then, of course, there was Mrs. Jennings, the housekeeper. Her initial willingness to cooperate had turned into a marked reluctance. She was more nervous than Miss Marple had expected, especially given how little she had to offer in terms of information. She had kept her story simple. Too simple, perhaps. What was she really hiding? Was it just the usual housekeeper's habit of being overly careful? Or had she been involved in something more illicit? Miss Marple sat still, her mind clicking through the possible motives. What had each person stood to gain? Who had the most to lose? The question gnawed at her, and she realized the theft of the ring was only the tip of the iceberg. There was something deeper at play here, a web of tangled desires, secrets, and fears. Everyone had a reason to be involved, yet none of their stories made sense on their own. She decided to begin sorting through the alibis, testing the connections between the individuals involved. The timeline, she realized, could hold the key. Elizabeth had placed the ring in the box and left the vestry. Simon had been seen coming and going, but no one could recall precisely when. Reverend Martin had been in the vestry during that time, but had he seen anything? Was it possible that he was the one who had taken the ring? Miss Marple considered it carefully. The vicar was an unlikely suspect, but perhaps not an impossible one. What was his connection to the bride and groom? Was there some hidden connection between him and Elizabeth that could explain his strange behaviour? Mrs. Jennings was the final piece of the puzzle. Miss Marple had been struck by the fact that the housekeeper had been present before anyone else, yet her story remained vague. Had she entered the vestry before anyone else, and was she the one who had seen something she shouldn't? Had she been protecting someone? Or was she too trying to cover her own involvement in a much deeper deception? Miss Marple turned her attention to the larger context of the wedding. There was no doubt that the stolen ring was valuable. More than just a simple piece of jewellery, it was an heirloom passed down through generations. But the more she thought about it, the more she wondered if the true value of the ring lay in something other than its material worth. Was it possible that the theft had nothing to do with the ring itself? Could the motive lie in the relationships between the people involved? The jealousy between the bride and groom, the hidden resentments between the vicar and the families, these were all things Miss Marple couldn't ignore. And then there was one final possibility. Had the ring been taken as a mere distraction, a way to draw attention away from something far more dangerous, a way to conceal a far more sinister plot? As the questions swirled in her mind, Miss Marple knew she had to act quickly. The web of motives was growing more complex with each passing moment. It was time to speak with the suspects again, this time one by one. The first person she called for was Mrs. Jennings. The housekeeper entered the small sitting room, her face drawn and tired. She had the same nervous air about her, but Miss Marple wasn't interested in her pleasantries. "I've been thinking about your story," Miss Marple said without preamble. "You say you arrived early and knocked on the vestry door, but there's something you've overlooked." Mrs. Jennings looked at her warily. "What do you mean?" "You were the first to enter the vestry, yes?" Miss Marple asked, leaning forward slightly. "And yet, when you opened the door, you found Reverend Martin inside. How is that possible if the door was locked?" Mrs. Jennings blinked, her lips parting as if to protest, but no words came out. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her eyes flickering with unease. "Tell me the truth, Mrs. Jennings," Miss Marple urged gently. "Did you see anyone leave the vestry before you knocked?" The housekeeper remained silent, but Miss Marple could see the hesitation in her posture. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Mrs. Jennings spoke in a low voice, her eyes not meeting Miss Marple's. "I didn't see anyone, but I heard something just before the door opened, a noise, something scraping, like something being moved." "And what do you think it was?" Miss Marple pressed. "I don't know," Mrs. Jennings whispered, almost to herself. "But I've heard that noise before. When I was cleaning the vestry last week, there was a sound like that too." Miss Marple's pulse quickened. There it was, the connection she had been waiting for. The housekeeper hadn't heard anything unusual. She had heard the sound of something being hidden, something that didn't belong. She had her answer. The ring hadn't simply been stolen, it had been moved. Someone had been trying to cover their tracks, and now it was time to find out who. Miss Marple stood up slowly, a quiet smile playing at the corners of her lips. It was all falling into place. She had seen enough. The web of deception was finally beginning to unravel, and soon the truth would emerge in all its tangled glory. The day was beginning to draw to a close, the sun casting long shadows across the churchyard, as Miss Marple sat in the quiet corner, reflecting on her findings. The mystery of the stolen wedding ring had taken many turns, but the web of deception was beginning to unravel. She could feel it, a sense of inevitability hanging in the air. She had uncovered the lies, the motives, the hidden fears, but there was still something elusive, something off about the entire situation. The more she pieced together, the more it seemed as though the answers were there, waiting to be uncovered, yet just out of reach. It was then that a breakthrough came. One that seemed almost too perfect to ignore. A local constable, eager to impress the inspector, had found something, a small silver cufflink. It was caught beneath a pew near the vestry door, glinting in the light as if it had been deliberately dropped there. The constable, beaming with self-satisfaction, brought it to Miss Marple, believing it to be the key to solving the entire case. "We found this right near the scene of the crime, Miss Marple," he said, his voice tinged with excitement. "It must belong to the thief, don't you think?" Miss Marple took the cufflink in her hand, turning it over carefully. It was a fine piece, of craftsmanship certainly. The initials engraved on the back were clear enough. S.C. It could have been anyone's, but it was enough for the authorities to seize upon. Simon Creswell's initials. The groom. It was the break they had been waiting for. Inspector Cook, who had been growing frustrated with the slow pace of the investigation, took the discovery as a sign that the case was all but solved. He stood tall in front of the assembled group, a sense of pride in his voice. "This is it. We've found the crucial evidence. The cufflink must have fallen from Mr. Creswell's pocket when he took the ring. We've been looking in the wrong places. This whole time it was him." The room was filled with murmurs of agreement. Simon Creswell's sudden defensiveness, his eagerness to rush through the investigation, his unexplained behavior, it all now seemed to point to one conclusion. The authorities, eager to close the case, were ready to declare the matter settled. Even Reverend Martin seemed relieved, though his nervousness hadn't entirely dissipated. Miss Marple, however, remained silent as the others celebrated their success. She could see the triumph in their eyes, hear the satisfaction in their voices, yet something nagged at her, a suspicion that she couldn't quite shake. She had seen too many cases like this, where the evidence seemed conclusive, the truth so clear. But then a twist would come, and everything would fall apart. Simon Creswell, looking as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders, finally spoke. "Well, I'm glad to know that we can put this behind us," he said with forced cheerfulness. "But surely you understand. This is all some mistake. That cufflink, yes, it's mine, but I didn't steal the ring." The words hung in the air, and Miss Marple studied him carefully. The slight tremor in his voice didn't escape her notice. It wasn't a tremor of relief, but of something deeper. It was fear. Fear of being exposed for something else. But what? She turned the cufflink over in her hand again. Yes, it was his. There was no mistaking that. But was it enough to solve the case? To point directly to Simon Creswell? No, it wasn't. There was something about it that felt staged. She could almost hear the echo of the word in her mind, a distraction. "Inspector," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but firm, "I believe we should proceed with caution before jumping to conclusions. This piece of evidence is indeed telling, but it doesn't explain everything. It doesn't answer all the questions. Inspector Cook frowned, but there was an edge of frustration in his expression. "What more is there to say, Miss Marple? We have the evidence. We've found the cufflink near the scene. We've questioned everyone. It's over." Miss Marple's eyes never left the cufflink. "Perhaps, but I would urge you to consider one thing. Whoever took the ring was careful, very careful. This is not someone who would leave behind something so easily identifiable. This cufflink, it's too convenient. It's almost as if it was planted to make us think we've found the culprit." The room grew silent. All eyes turned to her, but no one spoke for a moment. Miss Marple knew she was going out on a limb, but the nagging feeling inside her hadn't gone away. The pieces were in front of her, but they still didn't fit perfectly. Not yet. "I suggest we take a closer look at everyone's movements today," she continued. "We need to revisit the timing of events and the places where people were. There are still holes in the story that need to be filled." The inspector scowled. "I don't have the time for another round of questions, Miss Marple. The case is closed." But Miss Marple was already moving, her mind racing through the details. She couldn't shake the feeling that Simon's cufflink was a red herring, that it had been planted there to steer them in the wrong direction. There was more to this than met the eye. And if the authorities were too quick to declare the case solved, it was all too likely that the true criminal remained hidden in the shadows. As the evening wore on, Miss Marple took the opportunity to quietly speak with a few of the witnesses once again. She observed them more closely, looking for any inconsistency in their behavior, any crack in their stories that might point her to the truth. Each one had seemed so certain in their accounts earlier, yet the more she questioned them, the more their confidence seemed to erode. Reverend Martin, though relieved by the cufflink's discovery, still wore a haunted look in his eyes, as if he feared the attention would soon return to him. Mrs. Jennings had grown even more nervous, her fidgeting revealing that her earlier story wasn't as solid as she had believed, but it was Elizabeth Howard, the bride, who intrigued Miss Marple the most. The way Elizabeth had reacted to the announcement of the cufflink's discovery was strange. She had seemed almost too calm, too composed. The others had reacted with a sense of closure, but Elizabeth's face remained unreadable. It was as if the entire situation was not nearly as important to her as it should have been. A thought struck Miss Marple like a flash of lightning. Was it possible? Had Elizabeth played a deeper role in all of this? Had she staged the theft herself to shift suspicion onto Simon? It was a long shot, but it was the only theory that didn't quite fall apart under scrutiny. Miss Marple turned toward the bride, a quiet smile on her face. "Elizabeth, I hope you don't mind if I ask you a few more questions," she said softly. "It's just that something about the way things have unfolded today doesn't quite sit right with me. You see, it's not the cufflink that troubles me. It's the timing of it all." Elizabeth's lips pressed together, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. "What do you mean, Miss Marple?" "There's still one person who hasn't been accounted for, Elizabeth," Miss Marple continued. "And I believe that person has been hiding in plain sight all along." Elizabeth stiffened, her eyes widening ever so slightly. Miss Marple watched her closely, waiting for the truth to come spilling out. The pieces were falling into place. This false victory, this misplaced triumph was only the beginning. The real criminal was closer than anyone could have imagined, and Miss Marple knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came to light. The late afternoon sun filtered through the windows of the church, casting long, thin beams across the stone floor. The air was heavy with the lingering scent of incense and freshly cut flowers from the wedding. Yet the atmosphere, so full of joy just hours earlier, now felt thick with unspoken tension. As the minutes ticked by, Miss Marple found herself drawn back to one question, one key detail that had refused to leave her mind since the moment it was mentioned. It was not the cufflink, nor the missing ring that troubled her now. It was something else. A small piece of the puzzle, nearly forgotten, but not entirely irrelevant. Elizabeth Howard's past. Miss Marple had noticed the briefest flicker of something on the bride's face when her history was brought up earlier in the day. It had been subtle, easily overlooked. But Miss Marple had never been one to ignore such things. A look, a pause, a hesitance in a simple conversation. They were all clues, fragments of something much larger, something buried in the past, long before the wedding day. It wasn't until she'd begun reviewing the details of the case again that she realized what she had missed. Elizabeth had come from a modest family, one that had experienced significant financial struggles in recent years. Her father, once a well-respected businessman, had been embroiled in a scandal involving a bad investment, one that had ruined his reputation and left the family in financial ruin. At the time, it had made quite a stir in the local press. Miss Marple had seen the story in the papers, though she hadn't given it much thought at the time. It seemed too distant from the present to matter. But now, in the context of this case, it seemed anything but distant. The scandal had been quite a blow to the Howard family, but Elizabeth had always been careful to keep a low profile in the years following. She'd changed her name slightly when she married Simon, perhaps to distance herself from the negative press surrounding her family. What if that old scandal wasn't the only thing she'd been hiding? Miss Marple's mind clicked into place like a puzzle. The timing of everything, the theft of the ring, the way Elizabeth had reacted, her calm demeanor despite the tension in the air, it was all beginning to make sense. She had felt something was off about Elizabeth all along, but now she understood. This was about more than just a stolen ring. This was about a buried secret, something that had never been truly dealt with, something tied to her father's downfall. Suddenly, the quiet was interrupted by the soft tap of footsteps in the corridor. Miss Marple turned and saw Mrs. Jennings appear in the doorway. Her face was pale, and there was an odd look in her eyes. "I'm sorry to bother you, Miss Marple," Mrs. Jennings said quietly, "but I thought you should know something. It's about Elizabeth." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Go on." Mrs. Jennings shifted nervously, glancing down the hallway as if to ensure no one else was listening. "I overheard a conversation. It was just before the wedding, in the back of the church. Elizabeth was speaking to Simon, but, well, it wasn't a conversation I would have expected. She was angry. I heard her say something about not being able to go through with it, about everything being ruined because of what had happened with her father. She said if she didn't do something now, she'd never be free of the past. And then Simon, he just listened. He didn't argue. He seemed to be agreeing with her." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. This was the confirmation she'd been waiting for, the missing piece of the puzzle. But there was still something about it that didn't sit right. Why would Simon have been so quiet? Why didn't he protest if this conversation was so important to Elizabeth? Mrs. Jennings's words seemed to stir up a deeper connection, one that had been buried in the past, but had now come rushing to the surface. Miss Marple stood up slowly, a quiet resolve forming in her mind. She needed to speak to Elizabeth once more, but this time it would be different. This time Miss Marple wasn't interested in the surface answers. She was going to dig deeper, to uncover the hidden truths beneath the layers of politeness and restraint. Elizabeth was in the churchyard when Miss Marple found her, standing alone by a small, blooming rosebush. Her posture was straight, almost regal, but her eyes were distant. She didn't appear startled when Miss Marple approached, as though she had been expecting her all along. "Miss Howard," Miss Marple began softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "I do believe we have some unfinished business." Elizabeth's lips curled into a faint smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm afraid I'm not sure what you mean, Miss Marple." "Perhaps it's about your father's business dealings," Miss Marple replied, her voice steady but probing. "The scandal that nearly ruined your family. I've heard the stories, you know. It's not uncommon for such things to follow us, to cast a long shadow." Elizabeth's face went rigid, the colour draining from her cheeks. For a moment she said nothing, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. Then slowly, she turned to Miss Marple. "I thought I could leave it all behind," she said, her voice soft, as if the words were reluctant to escape. "I thought that if I married Simon, I could finally escape my father's mistakes. But you see, it doesn't work that way. The past, it never truly lets you go." Miss Marple felt the weight of the silence between them, the unspoken tension. She watched Elizabeth carefully, searching for any sign of emotion, any trace of guilt or fear. The bride's composure was faltering, but she still hadn't revealed everything. She was holding something back. "Did you know," Miss Marple continued, her voice measured, "that your father's creditors were still pursuing him even after the scandal? There were whispers in town that he was involved in something much darker than just bad investments." Elizabeth's gaze flickered for just a moment before she regained control. "That's not true," she said quickly, too quickly. "My father's mistakes were his own. He paid his dues, and I've tried to forget it all." Miss Marple studied her carefully. "And yet, when you were speaking to Simon before the wedding, you seemed to be on the verge of something important. What did you mean when you said things were ruined because of your father?" Elizabeth hesitated, her hands clenched at her sides, her knuckles white. "I didn't want to marry him at first," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I couldn't stand the thought of being tied to my father's mistakes, to his shame. But then Simon convinced me. It was the only way. He said we could escape it all, that we could start fresh. The pieces were falling into place." Miss Marple realized that the theft of the ring, the hidden motives, were not just about money or revenge. They were about Elizabeth's need to escape the chains of her past. The stolen ring had been a symbol, a way of severing ties with a history that had haunted her for too long. But why involve Simon? Why drag him into it? The answer was clearer now. Elizabeth had needed someone to help her, someone who could hide her father's secrets and restore her dignity. And Simon, it seemed, had been more than willing to play along, not just as a husband, but as an accomplice in a scheme that would allow them both to rewrite their pasts. Yet the truth was even more complex than Miss Marple had expected. The ring wasn't just a symbol of escape. It was a bargaining chip, a way to manipulate the future in their favor. They had staged the theft, intended to disappear, to leave the past behind, and to take control of their own lives once more. But somewhere along the way, the plan had gone wrong. Someone had tipped the scales. Someone had discovered their secret. And now, the question remained. Who? Who had been watching, waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth? Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she met Elizabeth's gaze. It wasn't just about the stolen ring anymore. It was about the lies, the hidden past, and the shadow it cast over them all. And Miss Marple knew. She was closing in on the truth. Miss Marple stood still for a moment, letting Elizabeth's confession settle in the air between them. It was clear now, more than just a stolen ring or a broken wedding. There was something deeply tangled in the fabric of this case. But as always, Miss Marple felt there was more to uncover, more beneath the surface than anyone had yet dared to reveal. Elizabeth's hesitation had already revealed cracks, but there was something else, something more. It was time for a different approach. Her eyes lingered on the rose bush next to her as a quiet thought sparked in her mind. A subtle, unconventional tactic, but one she had often used in the past. Miss Marple's ability to understand the human psyche, to read the small changes in body language and tone, could be far more revealing than any forensic evidence or direct questioning. Sometimes the best clues were found in the ways people reacted to the unexpected. "I must say, Miss Howard," she began, her tone soft but steady, "I am quite curious about Simon's role in all of this. It's clear now that he played a part, though you've yet to reveal the full extent of it. Perhaps you can tell me, why did he seem so resigned? Why did he not fight harder for you to go through with the marriage, as you say you almost didn't? I would think he would be devastated by the idea of losing you." Elizabeth's eyes darted quickly to the side. A flash of something, guilt, perhaps, crossing her face. But it was gone just as quickly as it had appeared. She forced a smile. "I suppose Simon is simply a calm man, Miss Marple. He doesn't show his emotions the way most do." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, slightly. "But you didn't answer my question. Why didn't Simon protest when you told him you couldn't marry him? Did he not care?" Elizabeth's posture shifted. Her shoulders, which had been tense, now relaxed as she gave a weak laugh. "I never said that," she replied quickly. "I'm simply saying that Simon is a practical man. He wouldn't want to pressure me if I wasn't ready. He's always been understanding." Miss Marple's sharp gaze softened slightly, but there was something in her tone that remained unyielding. "Of course. But tell me, Miss Howard, when was the last time Simon spoke with you privately about your father's past? His debt? His troubles? I imagine he must have learned a great deal about your family before you two were married, given the circumstances." Elizabeth froze. Her eyes tightened just enough to signal a shift in her composure. It was the smallest movement, the smallest crack, but it was enough. The facade had slipped. A lie was now half-formed in her throat, but she was struggling to keep it intact. She took a deep breath, her fingers clutching at the folds of her dress. "I told Simon everything before we got married. Everything about my family, about my father. He knows all about it." Her voice, though firm, lacked the conviction it had just moments ago. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "And yet, your conversation with Simon before the wedding, about not going through with it, about the past being ruined, that doesn't sound quite like the man who knows everything, does it? If he truly understood the full extent of your father's mistakes, surely he would have known the right thing to say, wouldn't he?" Elizabeth's eyes flashed. and Miss Marple saw her lips quiver as she held back something, a truth that threatened to spill over. I don't know what you're implying, Elizabeth said, her voice betraying her discomfort. The change in her demeanor was subtle, but unmistakable. Miss Marple had seen it countless times before, a shift from control to panic. It was not an uncommon reaction when someone felt cornered, and Elizabeth Howard was no different. But Miss Marple wasn't done yet. She needed to push further, just a little, to expose the truth that still eluded them all. I see, Miss Marple said slowly, almost as if musing to herself. You're right. Simon is a man of few words, a man who trusts his wife's judgment. But what if he trusted the wrong things? What if he believed something he shouldn't have? After all, I understand there's a certain connection between him and your father's business associates. One that perhaps wasn't mentioned in the stories of your past. Elizabeth's eyes widened, her chest rising and falling quickly as if trying to steady herself. It was a fleeting moment, but it told Miss Marple everything she needed to know. Simon had been far more involved in Elizabeth's family affairs than he had let on. He knew more than he had admitted, and this was no coincidence. Miss Marple smiled, faintly, satisfied with the reaction. Tell me, Miss Howard, how long has Simon known about the debts your father left behind, the creditors who kept coming after him despite his ruin? Her voice dropped slightly, not in accusation but in quiet observation. I've heard rumors, you see, not just from local gossip, but from a few of your father's old business associates. Elizabeth swallowed and her jaw clenched tightly. What are you talking about? She asked, her voice unsteady. I think you know exactly what I'm talking about, Miss Howard, Miss Marple replied. Simon knew all along. He knew about the debts, and he was helping your father conceal them, wasn't he? For the first time since their conversation began, Elizabeth's carefully maintained composure broke entirely. She took a step back, as though physically recoiling from the words, her eyes wide in shock. The confession, though unspoken, was already written in the way her breath caught and the way she failed to maintain her usual poise. Simon had nothing to do with it, she said hastily, her words tumbling over each other. He didn't know anything. I never wanted him involved. I wanted him to have nothing to do with my family's mess. Then why didn't he fight you, Miss Howard? Miss Marple pressed, leaning slightly forward. Why didn't he protest when you told him you were having second thoughts about the marriage? Elizabeth's lips trembled, and for a moment she seemed on the verge of collapse. The weight of her guilt was pressing on her, and Miss Marple knew that the truth was close to breaking free. Because Elizabeth's voice faltered, and she seemed to shrink under Miss Marple's steady gaze, because Simon was just as desperate as I was. He knew my father's secret. He knew the only way out was for us to marry, for us to take control of the business, to make the debts disappear. Miss Marple didn't blink. So Simon helped. Your father hid the debts, hoping the marriage would serve as a shield against the creditors. Elizabeth nodded, her eyes now filled with tears, the weight of her confession taking its toll. I was scared of the past catching up to me, scared of what people would think, and Simon thought that if we could pull it off, we could start fresh. But it all went wrong. Miss Marple gave her a soft, almost sympathetic look. And that is where the stolen wedding ring came in, wasn't it? a final effort to sever ties with the past, to make a clean break. Elizabeth's lips parted, but no words came out. The confession had been made, and in that moment, Miss Marple knew she had uncovered the truth. Simon had been a willing participant in Elizabeth's scheme, a man who saw the marriage as a way to escape financial ruin. But there was one thing neither of them had counted on. Their lies had been exposed. And now, it was only a matter of time before the consequences caught up with them both. But Miss Marple knew that the shadows of the past still held many secrets. And for some, the cost of deception was far higher than they could have ever imagined. The confession had barely settled into the room before Miss Marple felt the subtle shift in the air, a silent, lurking tension that stretched over her like a shadow. Elizabeth Howard's fragile admission had pulled the veil from the truth. But something about the way the woman was retreating now, her eyes darting toward the door as if she sought a quick escape, made Miss Marple uneasy. It was too easy. But before she could probe further, a knock came at the door. It was light at first, hesitant. And when it came again, Miss Marple instinctively knew who was on the other side. She glanced at Elizabeth, whose face had turned ashen. Her breathing quickened, as if she feared the arrival of whatever was about to unfold. "I'll get that," Miss Marple said gently, rising from her chair. She walked to the door, leaving Elizabeth staring vacantly at the ground. When she opened it, she found one of the local constables standing there, his face grave, his uniform slightly rumpled as if he had been rushing. "Miss Marple," he said in a low voice, "I'm afraid something's gone awry. You'll want to come with me." Without waiting for a response, he turned and started walking, his footsteps quick. Miss Marple followed, noting the unease in his posture and the clipped tone that had overtaken his usual calm demeanor. They passed through the hallways of the manor with urgency, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the old stone walls. As they reached the study, the constable opened the door to reveal the scene. Papers scattered across the desk, books knocked from their shelves, the room now in chaos. But what had caught Miss Marple's eye wasn't the disarray. It was the empty glass cabinet in the corner where the evidence had been kept. The wedding ring, the last crucial piece that could tie everything together, was gone. Her heart skipped a beat, but she masked her reaction with the careful calm that had served her so well. "What happened here?" she asked, her voice steady despite the swirl of thoughts forming in her mind. We don't know, Miss Marple," the constable stammered, glancing around the room as though the answer might appear in one of the shadows. "We were just going over the documents, making sure everything was accounted for. When I turned around, it was gone." Miss Marple stepped forward, her gaze sweeping over the dishevelled room. It was clear that whoever had taken the ring had been meticulous. The cabinet had not simply been opened and rummaged through. It had been undone carefully, as though the thief was confident no one would notice the intrusion for just a little while longer. The drawer of the desk had been pulled open, its contents shifted, but there was nothing else missing. Just the ring. "How long ago was it that you were last here?" Miss Marple asked, kneeling down to inspect the drawer, though she knew she wasn't going to find anything useful in the way of a clue. "About half an hour ago," the constable replied. "We left briefly to speak with the staff, check the rest of the house." Miss Marple stood slowly, her brow furrowing as she processed the information. The timing was too precise, the method too deliberate. Whoever had taken the ring knew that the authorities would be busy elsewhere, perhaps engaging with Elizabeth or investigating the other pieces of the puzzle. It was no coincidence that the ring had been stolen at the very moment the investigation had taken a decisive turn. Who else had access to this room? Miss Marple asked, turning to the constable. Her voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to it now. The constable hesitated, clearly uncomfortable under her gaze. Well, aside from yourself, Miss Marple, and the staff, it's only been the family. But Elizabeth was here earlier, and I believe Simon returned not long ago. Elizabeth, Miss Marple repeated, the name lingering in the air. She hadn't thought of the woman in that way before. Sure, there had been suspicions, but now it felt as though the threads were tightening, pulling her focus to the woman with increasing certainty. Elizabeth's sudden discomfort when she had spoken of Simon's role had struck Miss Marple as odd, and now, with the evidence gone, she couldn't shake the feeling that the game had shifted entirely. Has anyone else been in and out of the house since the ring was secured in the row cabinet? She pressed, her mind racing. Anyone from outside the immediate family? The constable shook his head, looking slightly baffled. No, Miss Marple. Only the staff have been moving about, but they haven't shown any signs of unusual behavior. Miss Marple felt a prickling sensation on the back of her neck. The entire situation felt staged, too controlled. Someone had wanted the ring gone, and they had chosen their moment with precision. She had to act quickly. This was no longer just about the ring. It was about silencing the truth before it could fully come to light. Very well, Miss Marple said, her mind already forming the next steps. Keep everyone here. No one leaves. Not yet. She moved toward the door, but just as she reached it, there was a sudden commotion outside. Voices raised in confusion. Then a loud shout. She hurried back to the hallway, where a group of staff members had gathered, looking shaken. In the midst of them was Simon, his face pale, eyes wide. I can't believe it, he was saying, his voice strained. It's gone. It's all gone, just like that. The ring, it's gone. Miss Marple's gaze locked on him, her suspicion deepening. There was something too rehearsed about his reaction, too forced. He was playing a part, but it didn't sit right with her. His words, his expression, they were too dramatic, too rehearsed for someone who had just been caught in a moment of crisis. Simon, she said calmly, stepping into the middle of the gathering, I suggest you tell me exactly where you were when the ring was taken. His eyes flitted nervously from her to the constable, then back to the others. I was with Elizabeth, he said quickly, his voice a little too fast. She was in the study with Miss Marple. I went out for a moment to check the grounds. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. Check the grounds? Yes, Simon stammered. I wanted some fresh air, and to be sure nothing was amiss. I didn't want anyone sneaking around while we were all busy with the investigation. Miss Marple studied him carefully, noting the slight tremor in his hands, the rapid movement of his eyes. There was no hesitation in his words, but there was an unmistakable shift in his body language, an admission in how desperately he was trying to cover his tracks. And as she watched him, the pieces began to fall into place, one by one. Simon, I'm afraid that your story is already beginning to unravel, Miss Marple said softly, but with the weight of undeniable truth. You've tried to bury the evidence, but I'm not sure you'll manage to escape this time. There was no more hiding behind false bravado. The game was afoot and Miss Marple was closing in. Miss Marple felt the air tighten around her, a sudden, unsettling weight bearing down on her shoulders. She had been so certain of Simon's guilt, his rapid, rehearsed denials, his exaggerated display of panic. But as the constable closed in on him, something in Miss Marple's chest tightened, a creeping sensation that told her this was not over. No, not by a long shot. The constable reached for Simon, but before he could grab him, the unmistakable sound of shuffling feet came from the stairwell. A thud, then a sharp, panicked shout. The group froze, instinctively glancing toward the source of the noise. Miss Marple's stomach turned, her instincts flaring. Without a word, she rushed forward, her heels tapping urgently against the floor, her mind already racing through possibilities. At the top of the stairs, the scene that greeted her was almost too bizarre to comprehend. A figure was sprawled across the landing, motionless, blood pooling beneath them. It was Simon. His body lay in a crumpled heap, face pale, his hand still clutching at the banister as if he had tried to catch himself but had failed. His eyes were wide open, locked in an expression of shock and confusion. "Simon!" Elizabeth's voice broke the stunned silence, her face drained of colour as she rushed forward, hands trembling. "What happened? What's happened to him?" Miss Marple didn't waste time with pleasantries. She crouched beside Simon, her experienced hands immediately checking for a pulse. There was nothing. His heart had stopped, but not from natural causes. The blood on the floor was fresh, and it was clear from the position of his body that he had fallen or been pushed, suddenly, and with great force. "He's been attacked," Miss Marple said calmly, though her heart pounded in her chest. She rose to her feet and turned to the constable, who had been slowly approaching, still frozen in shock. "Get him downstairs. We need to secure the area immediately." The constable nodded numbly, and together with the others, they carried Simon's body down into the sitting room. As they laid him on the rug, Elizabeth's sobs were uncontrollable. The room was thick with tension, every word that passed between them charged with the unknown. Miss Marple stood back for a moment, surveying the scene. There was a sickly stillness to the air now, and her mind worked furiously to piece together what had just unfolded. She glanced at Elizabeth, whose eyes were frantic, unable to meet anyone's gaze. "Miss Howard," Miss Marple began, her voice softer now but full of purpose. "What happened to Simon?" "I don't know. I heard the noise, and when I got to the top of the stairs, I saw him. He was already lying there." Elizabeth's voice was strained, but Miss Marple could tell that something wasn't right. The desperation in Elizabeth's eyes wasn't just the natural fear of a loved one witnessing a tragedy. It felt rehearsed, almost too practiced. "I see," Miss Marple said slowly, and then turned to the constable. "Please check Simon's pockets, immediately." The constable hesitated, but then obeyed. He knelt by Simon's body and began going through his clothes, his fingers searching swiftly but gently. When he reached Simon's coat pocket, he froze, pulling out a small object. It was a crumpled piece of paper, faintly stained with Simon's blood. He handed it to Miss Marple without a word. She unfolded the paper carefully, her eyes scanning the hastily written message. It was short, too, short to provide much insight at first glance. But as she read it, a chill ran down her spine. "The ring is only the beginning." She read the line over again, her mind spinning. The implication was clear. This wasn't just about the ring anymore. The thief, or murderer, was sending a message, and it was one that threatened everything they had uncovered so far. The case, it seemed, had taken an even darker turn. Someone was still pulling the strings behind the scenes. Someone who was just as dangerous as they were elusive. Whoever was responsible was no longer concerned with hiding their motives. They were sending a warning. "Miss Marple," the constable said, his voice breaking through her thoughts. "There's more." The words sent a jolt through her. She looked up quickly, expecting the worst, and saw that he was holding something else in his hand. Something small, gleaming under the dim light. He passed it to her carefully. It was the wedding ring. The realization hit Miss Marple with the force of a thunderclap. The ring was in Simon's pocket, covered in his own blood. This changed everything. It wasn't just about theft anymore. It was about eliminating someone who had gotten too close to the truth. Simon had been the one to try and keep the investigation contained, trying to steer the authorities in one direction while concealing his own involvement. But someone had silenced him before he could do any more harm to the real criminal's plan. "Whoever did this," Miss Marple said, speaking aloud but more to herself than anyone else, "wants to make sure we don't uncover the entire truth." Her jaw, mind raced as she pieced the information together. Simon had been a part of this web of deception, and now he was dead because he had started to uncover the truth about the ring, about the motives, about everything. But what was the connection? And why would Simon keep the ring on his person after it had been stolen? There was only one answer. The ring had always been the key. The key to something much larger than the robbery or the murder of the bride. "Get the staff together," Miss Marple instructed. "I need to speak to everyone, now." As the constable hurried off to gather the staff, Miss Marple stood by Simon's body for a moment, her mind working in overdrive. She knew now that she wasn't just solving a crime, she was preventing another. And whoever was behind it, whoever had managed to orchestrate this twisted game, was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. Miss Marple sat in the drawing room, the air heavy with the weight of uncertainty. The staff had gathered, their faces pale and filled with anxiety. She could sense the fear that hung over the room, like a tangible thing. Everyone was on edge, and who could blame them? Simon's murder had thrown them all into disarray, but Miss Marple knew she couldn't allow herself to be swept up in the panic. She had to focus. There were still questions to be answered, mysteries to be solved, and somewhere in the chaos there was a clue, something so small, so subtle that no one had noticed it yet. But she had, and it was beginning to take shape in her mind. The staff stood in a loose circle around her, their faces a mix of concern and suspicion. Elizabeth, pale and shaken, clutched a handkerchief to her mouth. She hadn't spoken since Simon's body had been discovered, but Miss Marple noticed the way her eyes flickered nervously when they landed on the others. "I need to know exactly where everyone was when Simon was found," Miss Marple said, her voice firm but measured. "Every one of you had an opportunity to act. I need to know who was where." The staff exchanged uneasy glances, but it was the gardener, Mr. Banister, who spoke up first. "I was outside, ma'am," he said, his hands trembling slightly. "Tending to the flowers just like I always do. Didn't see nothing out of the ordinary." Miss Marple nodded, then turned to the housekeeper, Mrs. Dawson, a sturdy woman with a no-nonsense demeanour. "And you, Mrs. Dawson?" "I was in the kitchen, Miss Marple," she replied quickly, her voice clipped. "Preparing dinner. I didn't hear a thing until the screaming started." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she studied her. There was something in her tone, an edge, perhaps, a slight hesitation when she mentioned the scream. But she didn't press it yet. She would save that for later. Next, she turned to the butler, Mr. Clark, who stood with his hands clasped behind his back. "And you, Mr. Clark?" "I was with Miss Howard." he said calmly. We were in the library, discussing a few matters of the household. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Elizabeth had been with him. That was interesting. She made a note to come back to that detail. Finally, she turned her gaze to the maid, Miss Brown, who stood nervously at the back of the group. And you, Miss Brown? I was upstairs, Miss Brown stammered, cleaning one of the guest rooms. I didn't hear anything until they found Mr. Simon. Miss Marple studied her for a moment longer than the others, trying to read her reaction. The maid's wide eyes, her fidgeting hands, it all felt wrong. But she said nothing, simply nodding as she moved on. I see, Miss Marple murmured, her mind already processing the answers. Each alibi seemed solid at first glance, but there were too many little inconsistencies, too many details that didn't add up. She needed to dig deeper. The key to the case, she was certain, lay hidden in plain sight. It was just a matter of recognizing it. Her gaze drifted to the fireplace, where a stack of logs sat neatly piled. It was an unremarkable sight, but for some reason her attention lingered on the arrangement. There was something about the way the logs were stacked that seemed off, as though they had been disturbed recently. She stood up abruptly and moved toward the fire, her steps steady and sure. The others watched her curiously, but no one spoke. Kneeling in front of the hearth, Miss Marple carefully moved the top log, revealing a small object wedged between two larger logs. She reached in and pulled it out, her fingers brushing against the cool, smooth surface. It was a small, silver key. For a moment, she simply held it in her palm, turning it over as she studied it. It wasn't an ordinary key. It was too ornate, too delicate, with intricate engravings etched into the metal. She felt the weight of it in her hand, as if it were a key to something far more significant than just a locked door. Miss Marple? Elizabeth's voice trembled. What is it? Miss Marple didn't answer at first. Her mind was already working, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to snap together in a way that felt almost too easy. The key was the breakthrough she'd been waiting for. She'd noticed something earlier, something subtle, but it had only just now clicked into place. The wedding ring, the message Simon had left, and now this key, its presence here, hidden in the fireplace, could no longer be a coincidence. Miss Howard, Miss Marple said, her voice steady but filled with an undercurrent of certainty. I believe you have some explaining to do. Elizabeth's face paled at the mention of her name. I don't know what you mean, she stammered. But Miss Marple could see the faintest flicker of fear in her eyes. Don't try to deny it, Miss Marple continued. You've been lying to us all along. The ring, the murder, the strange behavior. It all points to you. But you've been clever, hiding behind your facade of grief. What you didn't count on was me finding this. She held up the key, watching, as Elizabeth's gaze darted nervously to it. Where does this key fit? Miss Marple pressed. What is it for? Elizabeth opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her hands trembled violently at her sides, and for a moment Miss Marple could see the truth flickering in her eyes, an acknowledgement of guilt, a confession that had not yet found its voice. Tell me, Miss Howard, Miss Marple said, her voice low and deliberate. What were you hiding? The room was silent save for the crackling of the fire. And then, at last, Elizabeth spoke, her voice barely a whisper. It's the old family safe, hidden away in the study. The key unlocks it. Inside there's a fortune, money, documents, things Simon was never supposed to find. The words hung in the air like a dark promise, and Miss Marple knew then that she had found the heart of the mystery. The key, the ring, the murder, it was all connected, and now she was closer than ever to unveiling the full truth. Elizabeth stood frozen, her eyes wide with terror, as Miss Marple's gaze never wavered from her. The weight of her confession hung heavy in the air. She had been caught, and yet there was something about her demeanor, something in the way she hesitated to reveal the full truth that still troubled Miss Marple. The key was significant, but it didn't explain everything. The murder, the wedding ring. There was still a deeper thread running through this mystery, one that had yet to be fully untangled. You said there were things Simon wasn't supposed to find, Miss Marple prompted, her voice calm and unyielding. What exactly was in that safe that would drive you to kill him? Why was it worth his life? Elizabeth opened her mouth to speak, but only a choked sob escaped her lips. She glanced towards the others in the room, each of them waiting, whether with concern or suspicion, and then her shoulders slumped, as if the weight of her guilt had become too much to bear. She dropped her head into her hands, her voice barely above a whisper as she spoke again. It wasn't just money or documents, she confessed, her words muffled by her hands. It was something far worse, something Simon didn't know about, something I didn't want anyone to know. I did it to protect myself, and to protect the family. There was an edge to her voice now, a hint of desperation, as though the truth was finally spilling out. Miss Marple leaned in closer, watching Elizabeth carefully as she spoke, her eyes flickering to the other staff members in the room, but they remained silent, all of them tense, as though none of them dared to speak. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple pressed, her mind racing as she pieced together fragments of information. What could be so dangerous that you felt the need to go this far? Elizabeth hesitated before lifting her gaze, meeting Miss Marple's eyes with a mix of fear and regret. "It was Simon's mother," she said, her voice quivering. "She wasn't who she seemed. Simon had no idea. None of us did. She had secrets, things she'd done in the past. Terrible things. And when she died, she left it all to Simon. He didn't know what he had inherited. I had to stop him from uncovering the truth, Miss Marple." A shiver ran through the room as Miss Marple processed the weight of Elizabeth's words. Simon's mother, his late mother, had been hiding something. And Simon, in his quest for answers, had been on the verge of uncovering a secret so dark that Elizabeth had resorted to murder to keep it buried. "What kind of secrets?" Miss Marple asked, her voice steady. "What was so terrible that you couldn't let Simon find out?" Elizabeth's hand shook as she lowered it from her face. Her eyes were filled with a mixture of guilt and sorrow. Simon's mother was involved in a scandal years ago, a terrible one. She had an affair with a man who wasn't her husband, someone in this very household, and when the affair ended, she made sure no one ever found out about it. But when Simon began asking questions about his inheritance, he found documents that were linked to that man. He was getting too close, and I couldn't let him ruin everything. The room seemed to close in around Miss Marple as the implications of Elizabeth's words settled into her mind. An affair. a secret connection between Simon's mother and someone in the household. The pieces were falling into place, but it was still unclear who the mysterious man was. And why had Elizabeth gone to such lengths to silence Simon? Who was this man? Miss Marple asked, her tone sharp, demanding the answer that would finally reveal the full extent of the web Elizabeth had spun. Elizabeth's eyes darted nervously around the room, her gaze lingering on each of the staff members. Miss Marple noticed the way she avoided looking directly at Mr. Banister, the gardener. The way her eyes lingered just a moment too long on him, as though she were afraid to make eye contact. "It was Banister," Elizabeth whispered, her voice trembling. "The gardener. He was the one who had the affair with her." A murmur ran through the room at the revelation, and Banister's face drained of colour. He stepped back, as if trying to distance himself from the accusation, his hands trembling at his sides. No, that's not—" he started, but his voice faltered, and Miss Marple could see the truth in his eyes before he even spoke another word. "It's true, isn't it, Mr. Banister?" Miss Marple asked, her voice unwavering. "You were involved with Simon's mother, and when she died you thought Simon would learn of your past. You were willing to go to any lengths to keep your secret safe, weren't you?" Banister's lips trembled as he tried to form words, but there was no denying the guilt in his eyes. Finally he broke down, his shoulders shaking as he spoke. "It was years ago. She promised me it would stay hidden. I never meant for it to come to this. I loved her. But when Simon started asking questions, I panicked. I didn't want my past to ruin everything. And when I saw him, I couldn't let him expose me. Not after everything we'd built." Miss Marple stood in silence for a moment, taking in the gravity of what had just been revealed. The crime, she now realized, was not just a crime of passion or greed. It was the result of fear of the past coming back to haunt them both. Elizabeth had killed Simon to protect Banister, and Banister, in turn, had aided her in covering up the truth. But what Miss Marple had just uncovered went deeper than that. It was the psychological complexity of their actions, their willingness to kill, to destroy the one person who might bring their dark past into the light. The truth was so much more than just a hidden inheritance or a buried scandal. It was about the lengths to which people would go to protect their own sins, to bury the evidence before it could be exposed. Elizabeth and Banister had been willing to risk everything to keep their secrets safe, even if it meant taking a life. But in the end, their fear had led to their downfall. The pieces of the puzzle had finally come together, and Miss Marple knew the truth. The room was still, save for the rhythmic tick of the old clock hanging in the corner. Miss Marple stood by the window, her gaze steady as she watched the soft mist of the early evening gather outside. The air inside felt heavier now, charged with the inevitability of the confrontation that was about to unfold. All the pieces had fallen into place. Each revelation, each confession had led her here. The final thread of the puzzle was about to be pulled, and she would bring the truth into the light. Elizabeth and Banister stood just a few feet away, their expressions hollow, as though they could feel the tension between them, though neither dared to look at the other. Miss Marple had arranged for a final meeting, an assembly of all those involved. It was time for the last part of the plan to be set into motion. She turned from the window, her eyes meeting those of Banister, whose nervous gaze quickly flicked away. It was as if he could feel the weight of his actions pressing down on him. the inevitability of his exposure now fully realized. "Mr. Banister," Miss Marple began, her voice calm, "you're about to make one final decision. You've had your chances, your opportunities to step away from this, to tell the truth before it went too far, but instead, you and Elizabeth chose to cover up your past, to keep your secret buried, and now that secret has cost Simon his life." Banister's face tightened at the mention of Simon. The guilt was there, raw and undeniable, but the fear in his eyes was sharper now, as though he feared what might come next. He clenched his fists, unwilling to speak, but his silence spoke volumes. Elizabeth, on the other hand, seemed to shrink even further into herself. Her once confident posture had given way to something smaller, more vulnerable, as if the weight of everything she had done had become too much to bear. The truth had stripped her of the final vestiges of composure. She knew there was no more hiding. "I don't expect you to understand," Elizabeth spoke up, her voice barely audible. "But I did what I had to do. I loved Simon. I loved him more than anything, and I couldn't let him ruin everything. He would have exposed us. All of us." Miss Marple's expression softened, but her eyes remained sharp. "And you, Mr. Banister?" she asked, her voice now a little softer, but no less commanding. "How long did you think you could escape your past? How long did you believe you could hide it from everyone?" Banister shifted uncomfortably, his breath coming in short gasps. The room was closing in on him, the walls of his lies pressing tighter with each passing second. His mouth opened, but no words came out at first. He knew that escape was no longer possible. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," he finally said, his voice cracking. "I thought, if I just kept quiet, if I helped Elizabeth keep Simon from digging too deep, it would be over. But I was wrong. I didn't know it would go this far." "And yet you allowed it to," Miss Marple observed. "You allowed Simon to be killed to protect your secret. And now you've allowed Elizabeth to bear the weight of that murder, both of you, caught in your own lies." The tension in the room was suffocating now. The truth had been laid bare, and yet the final confrontation still hovered on the precipice of something darker. Miss Marple stepped closer, her demeanor calm, but there was a fierce determination in her eyes. Elizabeth's voice broke through the silence again, this time laced with a desperate edge. You can't just expose everything now." "It's too late. The past is dead, Miss Marple. Simon is dead. There's nothing left for anyone to gain. Please, let us go." She tried to take a step forward, but Miss Marple held her ground. "Let you go," Miss Marple repeated softly, almost incredulously. "You think I'd allow you to escape responsibility for murder? For manipulating the truth so that you could keep your precious secret? There is no escape, Elizabeth. No more hiding. You're already trapped in your own actions." Banister's face was contorted in a silent struggle now, his eyes darting nervously around the room as if searching for an exit. But there was no escape. The detective had ensnared him, and his heart was racing faster with each passing second. He had always been careful, always assumed he could control the situation. But now, it was slipping through his fingers. Then, in a sudden, sharp movement, Banister made a desperate attempt to flee. His hand darted towards his jacket pocket, and in that moment, Miss Marple was already ahead of him. With the quick precision of a seasoned observer, she reached out and grabbed his wrist, stopping him in his tracks. The struggle was brief, but the tension in the room was now at its peak. Banister's eyes flared with panic as he tried to pull away, but Miss Marple's grip was firm. "You're not going anywhere," Miss Marple said coolly, her eyes locking onto his, her voice unwavering. "You've made your move, but there's no way out. Your guilt has already been sealed." Banister froze, his defiance giving way to the truth. For the first time he seemed to realize the weight of his situation, the futility of trying to escape the inevitable. He sagged, his face turning pale as he sank back into the chair, his hands trembling. Miss Marple straightened up, her composure never faltering as she turned her attention back to Elizabeth. "As for you, my dear," she said softly, "it's time to face what you've done. You can't run from your conscience any longer. Not with everything you've done. Not with Simon's blood on your hands." Elizabeth didn't move. She simply stared at Miss Marple, the full weight of the situation crashing down on her. She had known it was coming, knew that sooner or later the truth would catch up with her. She had made her choices, and now they would define her. The room was silent for a long moment. The tension was thick enough to slice through, but Miss Marple's calm remained unbroken. She had orchestrated the trap with precision, allowing for no escape, no second chances, and in that moment, Elizabeth's shoulders sagged in defeat. She finally whispered the truth that had been suffocating her. "I didn't want anyone to know, but I killed Simon. I killed him to protect myself." "And Banister?" Miss Marple nodded quietly. The confession was complete. The final confrontation had come to an end. Banister and Elizabeth would face the consequences of their actions, but in that moment, Miss Marple allowed herself a brief, quiet exhale. The case was closed. The truth had been revealed. The tension in the room slowly ebbed away as Elizabeth's confession hung in the air, her shoulders sagging under the weight of her guilt. Miss Marple's mind, however, remained sharp and alert, her attention still flickering between the two suspects. It was a moment of victory, yes, but her instincts told her the case wasn't as neatly wrapped up as it seemed. As the police arrived to take Banister and Elizabeth into custody, Miss Marple stood by the window once more, her eyes scanning the dimming light of the evening. The investigation had come to a close in one sense, but something felt off, like a dissonant note in a melody. It was too clean, too perfect, and Miss Marple knew from experience that nothing in a case ever quite fit into such a neat package without a reason. The clink of handcuffs, the murmurs of the officers, all seemed to fade as her thoughts spun. Elizabeth's and Banister's confessions were, on the surface, a clear resolution. But Miss Marple's mind circled back to the details, the moments that had seemed inconspicuous at first, the oddities that didn't quite make sense, the inconsistencies. She had gathered the pieces, yes, but she hadn't yet felt the satisfaction of knowing the complete story. Suddenly the door to the room creaked open and Sergeant Grey entered, his face pale, his steps slower than usual. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low, almost hesitant. "I need to speak with you. It's about the case." She turned slowly, sensing the gravity in his tone. "What is it, Sergeant?" He looked uncomfortable, clearly wrestling with the weight of the information he was about to share. "We've just found something that doesn't quite fit. It's about Banister's alibi." Miss Marple felt her pulse quicken. She stepped toward him, her gaze now intense. "What have you found?" Sergeant Grey took a deep breath. "We've been going over everything again, retracing our steps. Banister's story about the night of Simon's death, the one he told, Us when we first questioned him. Well, it doesn't hold up anymore. Miss Marple's brow furrowed. What do you mean? His alibi. He said he was at a meeting that night, a business meeting that should have given him an unshakable alibi. But he hesitated, his face darkening. We spoke to everyone who was there. None of them remember him being there. Not a single one. A chill crept down Miss Marple's spine. The sense of finality she had thought was so close had slipped from her grasp like sand through her fingers. The room suddenly felt too small, too oppressive. She turned back to the window, trying to clear her thoughts, but her mind was spinning, pulling at the threads that had once seemed so tightly woven. Is it possible he lied about the meeting? Miss Marple asked, though she already knew the answer. It was almost certain now that Banister had not only been part of Simon's death, but had orchestrated it more carefully than anyone had realized. Gray nodded. We're also having another. Look at the phone records, his, Elizabeth's, Simon's. Something doesn't sit right with the timing of the calls. Banister made a call shortly before Simon was killed, and it wasn't to the meeting. It was to someone else, someone who hasn't been identified yet. Miss Marple's mind worked quickly, connecting dots that others might miss. A phone call. A meeting. And something buried beneath their words, hidden in plain sight. She turned back to Gray, her gaze sharp. Do you have the number he called? We do, Gray said, pulling out a small notepad and showing it to her. But there's a problem. The number leads nowhere. It's a burner phone. No records. No trace of it. That was when it hit her, the last elusive piece of the puzzle. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat as the realization struck her. She turned toward Gray, her voice now cold with certainty. The mastermind is still out there, isn't it? Gray's expression faltered, but he couldn't hide the truth in his eyes. Yes, Miss Marple. There's more to this case than we've uncovered so far. And Banister, he's not the one calling the shots. Miss Marple stood still for a moment, the room growing silent. She had underestimated the complexity of the situation. Banister and Elizabeth, though guilty, were simply pawns in a larger game, and whoever had masterminded it all had carefully orchestrated every step, using them as tools for a much darker purpose. She could feel it now, the sharp edges of the plan, all the pieces falling into place. The mastermind wasn't just concerned with keeping a secret. No, this had been something far more calculated, more dangerous, and it was someone far more capable than either Banister or Elizabeth. She turned to Sergeant Gray, her voice steady. We need to get back to the beginning. Simon's research. The thing that he found that got him killed. It wasn't just a threat to Banister's past. It was a threat to someone else's future. What do you mean? Gray asked, confusion in his voice. The ring. The missing wedding ring. It wasn't about its value. It was about the truth it represented. The connection it had to a much older crime. Something buried long ago. Someone knew Simon was getting closer to that truth, and they couldn't allow it to come to light. They've been manipulating this whole situation from the shadows. Gray's eyes widened, realization dawning on him. You're saying the real killer is someone who's been hiding in plain sight, Miss Marple finished for him. Someone who thought they had controlled everything. But they've underestimated one thing, the very thing they didn't count on. The truth, Gray whispered, his face pale. Yes, Miss Marple said, a slight smile tugging at her lips. And now that it's out, there's no running from it. As she spoke, the phone rang, and she reached for it before the first ring had even completed. "Miss Marple," the voice on the other end said. "We've got something. We found a name. The burner phone belonged to someone very close to the investigation." Miss Marple's heart raced as the name was read aloud. She had suspected it, but hearing it confirmed was another thing entirely. She had been right all along, and now the real mastermind would be exposed. But even as she prepared for the final confrontation, she knew one thing for certain. The game wasn't over. The last-minute twist had only just begun. Miss Marple stood in the heart of the dimly lit study, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup, the faint sound of the clock ticking in the background. The phone call had rattled her, but it also confirmed what she had suspected all along. The mastermind behind Simon's murder was not Banister or Elizabeth. The true architect of the plot had been watching from the shadows, patiently waiting for the moment to strike. She was no longer questioning the pieces of the puzzle. She had all the answers. It was clear now that the murder of Simon wasn't simply a crime of passion or greed. It had been orchestrated with precision, calculated, to silence a truth that could bring down far more than just the reputation of a businessman. It was a web of deceit that spanned years, hiding a connection so deep and convoluted, even she had almost missed it. But she hadn't. Not this time. The name the officer had given her had sent a chill down her spine. Evelyn Ren. The very same. Ren, who had been Simon's old acquaintance, someone with ties to his past, someone who had worked alongside him in ways that had never been disclosed. Miss Marple's mind worked quickly, piecing together the forgotten history. Ren had once been involved in a shadowy business deal that Simon had been digging into, a deal that had left behind not just a few financial ghosts, but personal ones as well. Evelyn Ren, she muttered, the name slipping out like an ominous whisper. As she glanced out the window, the storm clouds gathering in the distance seemed to mirror the dark turn the investigation had taken. She had come so close, and yet she now feared the worst, that this final puzzle piece too might slip away into the fog. Evelyn Ren had been a ghost. She had been clever, staying hidden in the periphery of the investigation while keeping her hands clean. But now that Miss Marple had connected the dots, she saw the full extent of Wren's manipulation. Wren had orchestrated everything, from the planted phone call to the forged alibis, to setting up Banister and Elizabeth as decoys to cover her tracks. As Miss Marple was piecing together this revelation, Sergeant Grey had entered the study, his face grim. "Miss Marple, we've got an update." She turned slowly, her heart beating a little faster now. "Go ahead." "We've traced the burner phone. It led us to a safe house, a small property on the outskirts of town. We were hoping to find Ren there, but when we arrived, the place was deserted. It's been cleared out, no sign of her." Miss Marple's lips pressed into a thin line, her mind already working ahead of the officer's words. "Of course, she's already gone." Grey looked uncertain. "You're suggesting she knew we were closing in on her?" "I'm certain of it. Ren was playing the long game, and now that we've pulled the strings, she's slipping away from our grasp." "But she can't have gotten far," Grey protested. "She's too exposed. We'll find her." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her voice calm, but there was an edge of finality to it. "But remember, Sergeant, she is as clever as they come. She will know exactly how to vanish." The storm outside had intensified, the rain lashing against the windows, as if nature itself mirrored the tension in the room. Miss Marple placed her teacup down, the porcelain clinking softly against the saucer. "There's something else," she said, her voice low. "There's something important I missed earlier, something hidden in plain sight. Simon's research. It wasn't just about uncovering Ren's past crimes. No, it was the final piece of the puzzle in her long-standing quest for power." Grey frowned. "You've lost me, Miss Marple." Miss Marple's eyes locked onto his, her gaze sharp as ever. "The ring, Sergeant. The wedding ring. It was never about wealth or love, not in the way we thought. It was a symbol of a connection, a link between two people. The person Ren was trying to protect wasn't Banister or Elizabeth. It was someone far more powerful, someone she was willing to kill for." Grey's eyes widened. "Someone high up?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "And when Simon's investigation started to unravel that secret, when he threatened to expose the truth, Ren took matters into her own hands. She made sure Simon would never get the chance to finish his work." The officer's breath hitched. "So we've been chasing shadows all this time, and Ren, she's the real mastermind." Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed, but now the question is, who was she protecting?" The answer came to her almost in a flash, a memory that had been buried beneath the surface. She remembered the whispered rumors, the names that had circled around Simon's research before he died, the connections he had begun to draw between Ren and someone higher up in the business world, someone whose power extended far beyond what anyone could imagine. Ren wasn't just keeping a secret, Miss Marple continued. She was trying to protect a reputation that could bring down a network of influential people. And now, we're left with nothing but the wreckage she's left behind. Just then, Sergeant Grey's phone rang, pulling Miss Marple from her thoughts. He answered quickly, his voice tense as he listened intently. His eyes shot to Miss Marple, a look of disbelief spreading across his face. "We've lost her," he said, his voice taut. "She's vanished. The car we traced her to. It's gone. She's gone." Miss Marple's heart sank, but she remained composed. The threads she had uncovered, these webs of lies, manipulation, and dark secrets, were unraveling before her eyes, but the escape of the true culprit seemed to be the final act of this elaborate deception. "Justice is a tricky thing, Sergeant," Miss Marple said quietly, turning back toward the window, her fingers tapping against the edge of the sill. "Sometimes it slips through your fingers, no matter how tightly you grasp." "But what now?" Grey asked, his frustration evident. Miss Marple turned, her face serene despite the undercurrent of unresolved tension. "Now we wait. We wait, because the truth always comes back around. And when it does, even the most elusive of criminals cannot escape the consequences forever." She paused, staring into the storm, feeling the weight of the case settle within her. Justice. It will find its way, whether in this world or the next. Outside, the rain continued to fall. The storm, like the case, would soon pass. But for now it lingered, leaving behind the quiet hum of unanswered questions. The hunt was over, but the mystery remained in the shadows, elusive, still slipping away just out of reach. The storm had finally passed, but Miss Marple remained at the window, staring out at the clearing sky. The streets were slick with rain, and the heavy scent of wet earth hung in the air. Despite the clarity outside, the weight of the case still lingered in her mind, the final thread of the mystery dancing just beyond her grasp. She had solved it, yes, Ren had been the mastermind, a woman with too many secrets to keep, too many lies to hide. But there was something unsettled, an unease that wouldn't let go. The truth had emerged, and yet Miss Marple could not shake the feeling that something vital had slipped away, something she had missed in her pursuit of justice. Perhaps it was the way Ren had disappeared, or how every step in the investigation had led them to a conclusion that was almost too clean, too neat. Ren's escape had been too well timed, her disappearance too convenient. The flicker of doubt gnawed at her as she turned away from the window, her mind replaying every detail of the case. She had followed the evidence, pieced together the tangled motives, and confronted the villain at the last moment. Yet the more she thought about it, the more it seemed that the true mastermind had not been caught at all. Ren might have been the hand that struck, but who had been the mind behind it all? As if on cue, her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Miss Marple opened it to reveal Sergeant Grey, his face as taut and weary as she had last seen it. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low. "I think we might have missed something." "More than likely," Miss Marple replied, her voice calm, but filled with a sharpness that betrayed her exhaustion. "What is it now?" He handed her a folded sheet of paper, a cryptic message scrawled in hurried ink. It was a letter, but the words were not those of a confession. No, this was something else, something that carried a different kind of weight. "I never should have let it get this far," the letter began. "The truth, Miss Marple, is far darker than you can imagine. Ren was only one piece of the puzzle. But it was a mistake to think that removing her would solve everything. If you think the story ends with her disappearance, you are gravely mistaken. There is another, lurking in the shadows. You've been chasing ghosts, and the real game is yet to begin." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat as she read the final lines. "If you want to understand the true cost of Simon's death, you must look further back. The answers lie with the people you least expect. Watch your back, Miss Marple. This is far from over." She looked up at Grey, her eyes hard with realization. "It's not over, is it?" He shook his head, his face pale. "No, Miss Marple. I don't think it is." The detective stood in the middle of the room, the letter now a weight in her hands. For a moment, time seemed to slow. The world outside had calmed, but in the quiet of the room, the puzzle pieces scattered again. The letter had been left too conveniently, a final warning, perhaps, or an invitation to dive deeper into a world of shadows that she had just begun to understand. "Who sent this?" she asked. Grey shook his head again. "We don't know. It came from an anonymous source. There's no return address, no name, just the message." Miss Marple felt a chill creep down her spine. She had believed the case was closed, that the villain had been identified, and the truth had been laid bare. Yet here she stood, holding a letter that hinted at a greater mystery, a deeper conspiracy that had been hidden in plain sight. Ren's escape had not been a clean getaway. It had been a signal, a message that someone else was pulling the strings. "Where do we go from here?" Grey asked, his voice heavy with the weight of the unknown. Miss Marple's gaze moved to the fire crackling in the hearth. The case had felt like it was coming to a resolution, like the final curtain was about to fall. But the letter had rewritten the script. There was more to uncover, and something told her that the next chapter would be even more complex, even darker. "I'm afraid," Miss Marple said quietly. "We've only just begun." Gray watched her, a mix of admiration and wariness in his eyes. "Then what's our next step?" "The same as it always is," Miss Marple replied, her voice steady but resolute. "We follow the thread no matter where it leads. The game is not over, Sergeant, it has only just begun." As Gray left, the room fell into an eerie silence. Miss Marple remained standing by the fire, the letter still gripped tightly in her hand. Her mind worked quickly, racing through the possibilities, every new detail fitting together like a tangled knot that refused to be untied. For now, she would wait. She would let the threads of the mystery twist and turn, knowing that the answers would come in time. But one thing was certain. There would be more to this story. The world she had stepped into was far from simple, and it would not release its secrets so easily. As the rain began to fall again, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the future, to the mystery that waited just beyond the horizon. There was always another mystery, always another case to solve. And Miss Marple, ever patient, would be there to uncover the truth she always was.